The sun hung low over the northern Burkina Faso landscape, casting long shadows across the barren terrain. Ibrahim Traoré sat in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, his eyes scanning the horizon with the practiced intensity of a man who had seen too much death. The convoy moved slowly along the deteriorating road that connected the garrison at Djibo to the embattled outposts further north. Dust billowed behind them like smoke signals announcing their presence to anyone watching from the rocky outcrops that dotted the savannah. The heat was oppressive, even with the windows down. Traoré wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, his military fatigues already soaked through despite the early hour. Beside him, Lieutenant Ouagadougou gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his jaw set in concentration. They had been driving for nearly 2 hours, and the tension in the vehicle was palpable. "How much further to the checkpoint?" Traoré asked, his voice cutting through the rumble of the engine. "Another 15 kilometers, Captain," Ouagadougou replied, not taking his eyes off the road. "But this stretch is bad. JNIM has been active here in the past week. 2 supply convoys were hit last month." Traoré nodded, his hand instinctively moving to check his sidearm. Behind them, 3 more vehicles followed in tight formation, 2 transport trucks carrying supplies and medical equipment, and 1 technical mounted with a heavy machine gun. 20 soldiers in total, all of them volunteers who had chosen to serve despite knowing the odds. In the past year alone, hundreds of their comrades had fallen to jihadist attacks, and the government they once served had proven incapable of protecting them or providing adequate equipment. That was why Traoré had joined the coup that September. He had watched good men die because politicians in Ouagadougou were too busy lining their pockets to supply proper ammunition or reinforcements. He had held dying soldiers in his arms, men who whispered final messages to families they would never see again. The previous regime had failed them utterly, and something had to change. The landscape around them was desolate, a mixture of sandy soil, scattered acacia trees, and thorny shrubs that somehow survived in this harsh climate. To the north, the land gradually transitioned into the Sahel proper, where rainfall was scarce and life clung to existence by sheer force of will. This was contested territory, where the border between government control and jihadist influence shifted like sand in the wind. "Captain, up ahead!" Ouagadougou's voice was sharp, and he began slowing the vehicle. Traoré leaned forward, squinting through the dusty windshield. About 200 meters ahead, something was blocking the road. As they drew closer, he could make out the shape, a donkey, standing motionless in the center of the dirt track. The animal's head was lowered, its body trembling. "Stop here!" Traoré ordered, raising his hand to signal the convoy behind them. The vehicles came to a halt, engines idling. The sudden silence was unnerving. No birds sang, no wind rustled through the sparse vegetation, just the ticking of cooling engines and the labored breathing of nervous men. Sergeant Cabaret appeared at Traoré's window, his rifle held ready across his chest. "Sir, could be an ambush. That animal doesn't look right." Traoré studied the scene carefully. The donkey stood utterly still except for its trembling, its ears flat against its head. Something had frightened it badly. But what? He scanned the surrounding area. To the left, the land rose slightly into a series of low hills. To the right, a shallow ravine cut through the landscape, its bottom invisible from the road. "No bodies," Traoré muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "No abandoned vehicles. If this were a typical ambush setup, they would have left something more substantial as bait. Unless they're counting on us to approach the animal and trigger an IED," Ouagadougou suggested, his voice tense. It was a valid concern. The jihadists had become increasingly sophisticated in their tactics, learning from conflicts across the Sahel and Middle East. Improvised explosive devices were a favored weapon, cheap to make, devastating in impact, and terrifying in their unpredictability. Traoré opened his door slowly, keeping the vehicle between himself and the donkey. The metal was hot to the touch, radiating the accumulated heat of the morning sun. He raised his binoculars and examined the road surface around the animal. Nothing obvious, no disturbed earth, no wires, no signs of recent digging. "Captain, with respect, you shouldn't expose yourself," Cabaret said firmly. The sergeant was older, a veteran of multiple deployments, and he spoke with the authority of experience. "I'm aware of the risk, Sergeant," Traoré replied calmly, "but we can't sit here indefinitely. Check the thermal scope. Any heat signatures in the hills or the ravine?" One of the soldiers in the rear vehicle had a thermal imaging device, salvaged from equipment the French had left behind. It was temperamental, but it worked often enough to be useful. Traoré radioed back, and a tense minute passed while they waited for the scan. "Two possible signatures in the ravine, sir," came the response over the radio. "High faint, but they're there. Could be animals, could be humans trying to mask their heat." Traoré's instincts, honed by 3 years of fighting in this unforgiving landscape, began to tingle with warning. The frightened donkey, the empty road, the suspicious heat signatures, it all added up to something wrong. But what exactly? An ambush was possible, even likely. But something about the setup didn't fit the usual J9M pattern. "I want eyes on that ravine," he ordered. "Corporal Ouedraogo, take 2 men and circle around from the north. Stay low, stay quiet. Don't engage unless you're certain of the threat." As the 3 soldiers began their cautious approach, Traoré kept his attention split between them and the surrounding terrain. The donkey still hadn't moved, and that alone was strange. Animals fled from danger or froze in terror, but this seemed different, as if the creature was deliberately blocking their path, trying to warn them. It was an absurd thought, he knew. Animals didn't think strategically. And yet, in this war, he had learned that survival often came down to trusting your instincts, even when they defied logic. The minutes stretched out, each one feeling like an hour. The sun climbed higher, and the heat became almost unbearable. Traoré could hear the men behind him shifting nervously in their vehicles, checking weapons, adjusting body armor that provided more psychological comfort than actual protection against the weapons they faced. Then Ouedraogo's voice crackled over the radio, barely above a whisper. "Captain, you need to see this." Chapter 2. Traoré moved quickly but carefully, keeping low as he made his way toward Ouedraogo's position. Ouedraogo wanted to come with him, but Traoré ordered him to stay with the convoy and maintain security. If this was a trap, he needed someone capable to take command if he fell. The terrain was rough, scattered with rocks and thorny shrubs that tore at his uniform as he moved. The earth beneath his boots was hard-packed and dusty, each step raising small clouds that hung in the still air. Sweat ran into his eyes, but he didn't pause to wipe it away. His rifle was held ready, safety off, his finger resting alongside the trigger guard, as he had been taught. Ouedraogo had taken position behind a cluster of boulders on the lip of the ravine. When Traoré reached him, the corporal simply pointed downward, his face pale beneath his dark skin. Traoré carefully moved forward and looked down into the ravine. What he saw made his blood run cold. The ravine was deeper than it had appeared from the road, perhaps 10 meters from top to bottom. Its floor was littered with rocks and sparse vegetation, and a dry streambed indicated that water flowed here during the rainy season. But that wasn't what held Traoré's attention. Hidden in the shadows beneath an overhang were at least 15 men, possibly more. They wore the typical garb of JNIM fighters, mismatched military fatigues, wraps around their heads and faces, bandoliers of ammunition across their chests. Several had RPGs propped against the rocks beside them. Traoré could see at least 3 heavy machine guns set up on tripods, their barrels pointing toward the road where his convoy sat exposed. They were preparing an ambush, but something was wrong with the picture. The fighters weren't in position, they weren't focused on the road or watching for targets. Instead, they seemed agitated, arguing among themselves in urgent whispers that carried faintly up to Traoré's position. 2 men were pointing back along the ravine, towards something Traoré couldn't see from his angle. Others were gesturing frantically, as if disagreeing about what to do. "They haven't seen us yet," Ouedraogo whispered. "I don't think they even know we're here." "No," Traoré agreed softly, his mind racing. They're distracted by something else. He studied the scene more carefully. The fighters were clearly experienced. Their weapons were well maintained. Their positioning in the ravine showed tactical awareness, and the setup would have been devastating if the convoy had continued down the road. The elevated machine guns would have raked the vehicles from a superior angle, while the RPGs would have taken out any transport truck or technical. His men would have been trapped on the road with no cover, caught in a killing zone. If the donkey hadn't blocked their path, they would have driven straight into the trap. "What's that sound?" one of Ouedraogo's men whispered, a young private whose name Traoré couldn't recall. The soldier was pointing along the ravine, his expression puzzled. Traoré listened carefully. Beneath the murmur of the arguing fighters, he could hear something else, a rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, but deeper and more resonant. And there was a smell too, faint but distinct, the musky, slightly sweet odor of an animal. He shifted position carefully, moving along the lip of the ravine to get a better angle. What he saw made him understand everything in an instant. Further along the ravine, partially hidden by a bend in the rock walls, was the donkey's foal. The young animal was trapped, having apparently fallen or wandered into a narrow section of the ravine and become wedged between the rocks. It was struggling weakly, its sides heaving with effort and fear. The sound Traoré had heard was its distressed breathing. The mother donkey on the road hadn't been marking an ambush point. She had been trying to get help for her trapped offspring, standing in the path of the first humans she had encountered, desperate and frightened, but unable to communicate her need in any way, except to block their progress. And the jihadists had stumbled across the foal while setting up their ambush. Now they were arguing about what to do. Some apparently wanted to kill it to eliminate the noise. Others seemed concerned that gunfire might alert potential targets, and still others appeared to be suggesting they simply leave it and hope it died quietly. Traoré made his decision quickly. He pulled out his radio and switched to the encrypted channel they used for tactical communications. All units, listen carefully. We have approximately 15 to 20 JNIM fighters in the ravine east of our position. They're preparing an ambush, but are currently distracted. I want a two-pronged assault. Traoré, take 7 men and circle around to cut off their escape route to the north. Ouagadougou, position the technical to provide covering fire from the high ground. On my signal, we take them. There was a moment of stunned silence before Traoré responded. Captain, are you certain we're outnumbered and they have superior positioning? They have superior positioning for an ambush on the road, Traoré corrected. But they're not in defensive positions. They're clustered together, distracted, and their weapons aren't oriented for close combat. We have surprise on our side, and we're not going to get a better opportunity than this. He could hear the hesitation in Traoré's voice when the sergeant acknowledged the order. They all knew the risks, but they also knew what would happen if they withdrew. The jihadists would eventually take up their positions, and the next convoy that came through, soldiers, civilians, aid workers, would be slaughtered. This was an opportunity to strike first, to take the initiative away from an enemy that had held it for too long. Chapter 3. The next 10 minutes were a masterclass in controlled chaos. Traoré watched from his elevated position as his men moved into position with practiced efficiency. Traoré led his team in a wide arc around the ravine, using the sparse terrain features for cover. They moved in pairs, each pair covering the other's advance, their discipline evident in every movement. Ouagadougou had maneuvered the technical onto a small rise that gave it a clear field of fire into the ravine. The machine gunner was visible, a young corporal named Diallo who had earned his position through steady nerves and excellent marksmanship. Traoré could see him adjusting the weapon's elevation, calculating angles, preparing for the signal. In the ravine below, the jihadists remained focused on their argument. Traoré counted them again, 19 men that he could see, possibly more hidden deeper in the shadows. The odds weren't good, but they were better than they would have been in an ambush situation on the road. Here, at least, they had the element of surprise. His handheld radio crackled softly. Northern position secured, Traoré reported. We have visual on their escape route. Ready on your order, Captain. Technical in position, Ouagadougou added. Clear field of fire. Traoré took a deep breath, his heart pounding but his hands steady. This was the moment that separated soldiers from casualties, the instant when decisions made under pressure would determine who lived and who died. He thought briefly of the previous regime's failures, of the soldiers who had died because of inadequate support and incompetent leadership. That wouldn't happen today, not under his command. On my mark, he said into the radio. 3, 2, 1, execute. The technical's heavy machine gun opened up first, its staccato roar shattering the desert silence. Tracer rounds laced the air, bright even in the morning sun, as Diallo walked fire into the ravine. The effect was immediate and devastating. The jihadists, caught completely by surprise, scattered in confusion. Some tried to reach their weapons, others dove for cover, and a few simply froze in shock. Traoré and Ouagadougou opened fire from their position, their rifles cracking in rapid succession. Traoré aimed carefully, picking his targets, each shot deliberate. One fighter who had grabbed an RPG went down before he could aim it. Another, reaching for a machine gun, jerked and fell as Ouedraogo's bullets found their mark. From the north, Caboret's team added their fire to the assault. The jihadists were trapped in a kill zone of their own making, caught in crossfire from 3 directions with nowhere to run. Some tried to fight back, raising their weapons and firing wildly toward the sources of incoming fire, but they were disorganized, panicked, unable to coordinate a defense. The firefight lasted less than 3 minutes, though it felt like an eternity. The sound was overwhelming. The hammering of the machine gun, the crack of rifles, the ricochet of bullets off rocks, the screams of wounded and dying men. Smoke and dust filled the ravine, turning the air thick and acrid. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the firing stopped. Traoré held up his hand, signaling ceasefire. The sudden silence was almost painful after the cacophony of battle. His ears rang, and he could smell the cordite from the gunfire, sharp and chemical in the desert air. "Sound off," he ordered over the radio. "Casualties." One by one, his men reported in. Miraculously, they had suffered no losses. Private Zabre had taken a graze across his shoulder, painful but not serious. Corporal Nakanabo had twisted his ankle moving through the rocks, but everyone was alive. Everyone was functional. In the ravine below, it was a different story. Bodies lay scattered among the rocks, some motionless, others writhing in pain. A few fighters had managed to escape into the deeper reaches of the ravine, but Caboret's team had cut off the main escape route. Traoré could see one man trying to crawl away, dragging a shattered leg behind him. "Secure the area," Traoré commanded. "Caboret, sweep the ravine. I want any survivors disarmed and secured. Ouedraogo, have the medic ready? We take prisoners, not trophies." He began descending into the ravine carefully, his rifle still at the ready. Ouedraogo followed close behind, covering his captain's back. The descent was treacherous, loose rocks shifting under their boots, but they made it to the bottom without incident. Up close, the aftermath of the firefight was stark. Most of the jihadists were dead, their bodies twisted in the awkward poses of violent death. A few were wounded, groaning or crying out in pain. Traoré's men moved among them efficiently, collecting weapons, checking for threats, administering first aid where possible. One of the fighters, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, grabbed at Traoré's leg as he passed. His face was contorted with pain, blood seeping from a wound in his abdomen. "Please," he gasped in French, "please, water." Traoré knelt beside him, pulling out his canteen. As he held it to the young man's lips, he studied his face. He saw fear there and pain, but also something else, confusion, perhaps even regret. This was someone's son, maybe someone's brother or husband. A human being who had made choices that led him here, to die in a rocky ravine far from wherever he had called home. "What's your name?" Traoré asked softly. "Hamidou," the young man whispered. "I'm sorry, I didn't want... I thought we were..." He died before he could finish the sentence, his eyes going vacant, his body going limp. Traoré closed the young man's eyes gently, then stood up, his jaw tight. This was the reality of the war they were fighting. Not glory, not heroism, but young men dying in the dirt, their last words unfinished, their reasons forgotten in the moment of death. It was necessary. He believed that the jihadists had been preparing to kill his men, had killed countless others before, but necessary didn't make it easy, and it certainly didn't make it satisfying. "Thais, Captain, you need to see this." Chapter 4. Sergeant Caboret was standing near the bend in the ravine where the donkey foal was trapped. Traoré walked over, stepping carefully around bodies and discarded weapons. As he approached, he could hear the young animal's labored breathing more clearly now, punctuated by occasional weak bleats. The foal was wedged between 2 large rocks, its legs splayed awkwardly. It had clearly been there for some time. Its coat was matted with sweat and dust, and its eyes showed white with fear and exhaustion. But it was alive, and as Traoré knelt down beside it, the animal turned its head toward him, nostrils flaring. "We can't leave it here," Caboret said, his voice rough. The sergeant was a hard man, scarred by years of combat, but even he couldn't hide his concern for the trapped creature. "It'll die slowly if we do." "No, we can't," Traoré agreed. He studied the rocks carefully, assessing the situation. "If we lever this boulder on the left, we might be able to create enough space for it to squeeze through. Corporal, Bring some rope from the vehicles and find something we can use as a fulcrum." As his men worked to gather the necessary materials, Traoré radioed back to the convoy. "Sawadogo, status report." "How's the perimeter?" "Secure, Captain. The mother donkey is still on the road, hasn't moved. Should we, I don't know, try to move it?" "No, leave her be. We'll bring her foal up shortly. Any signs of additional enemy activity?" "Negative. The area is quiet, but Captain, we should move soon. That firefight will have been heard for kilometers. If there are other JNIM units in the area, they'll be investigating." It was a valid concern. The jihadists often operated in loosely coordinated cells, and while this particular group had been neutralized, there could be others nearby. Every minute they remained stationary was a minute longer they were vulnerable. "Understood. We'll be moving in 10 minutes. Traoré out. The rope and a piece of metal rebar from the supplies arrived, and Traoré's men set to work. It took several attempts, with 3 soldiers putting their weight on the makeshift lever, while others pulled at the rope looped around the boulder. The rock shifted grudgingly, scraping against its neighbors with a grinding sound that set everyone's teeth on edge. "More leverage," Traoré urged. "They're almost there." With a final heave, the boulder shifted enough to create a gap. The foal, sensing freedom, struggled frantically. For a moment, Traoré feared it would injure itself further in its panic, but then it managed to pull its front legs free, then its hindquarters, and suddenly it was standing in the open ravine, trembling but mobile. "Easy, easy," Traoré murmured, approaching the animal slowly. The foal's legs were scraped and bruised, but nothing appeared broken. It would be sore for days, but it would live. He ran his hands gently over its body, checking for serious injuries, while the young animal stood still, either too exhausted or too traumatized to bolt. "Sir, we need to move," Kabore reminded him, though there was understanding in his voice. "We're exposed here." Traoré nodded. "Right. Let's get this little one up to the road." Getting the foal up the ravine wall proved easier than expected. The animal seemed to understand that these humans were trying to help, and it followed them with only minimal coaxing, picking its way carefully up the rocky slope. When they reached the top, the mother donkey on the road immediately began braying, a sound of relief and recognition that was unmistakable. The reunion was touching in its simplicity. The mother rushed to her foal, nuzzling it frantically, checking it over with the thoroughness of any concerned parent. The foal, for its part, pressed close to its mother's side, finally safe after its ordeal. For a moment, Traoré and his men just watched, a brief respite from the violence and tension of their mission. Then the donkey turned to look directly at Traoré. It was probably just coincidence, probably just the animal's natural wariness of humans, but in that moment, Traoré could have sworn there was something like recognition in those large, dark eyes, something like gratitude. "Let's mount up," he ordered, breaking the spell. "We're behind schedule, and we need to clear this area." His men moved efficiently, returning to their vehicles, securing the captured weapons and equipment, loading the few surviving prisoners into one of the trucks. The wounded were separated from the others and given what medical care could be provided under the circumstances. One of the prisoners, an older man with graying beard, kept muttering prayers under his breath. Traoré ignored him, focused on the tactical situation. As the convoy prepared to move out, the mother donkey and her foal moved off the road of their own accord, heading toward a distant stand of acacia trees where there might be shelter from the sun and perhaps some vegetation to graze on. Traoré watched them go, then climbed back into his vehicle. "What are you thinking, Captain?" Sawadogo asked as they started moving. "I'm thinking we got lucky," Traoré replied honestly. "If that donkey hadn't blocked the road, we would have driven right into their kill zone. Most of us would be dead right now." "Do you believe in signs? In fate?" Traoré was quiet for a moment, watching the harsh landscape roll past. "I believe in staying alert. I believe in trusting your instincts. And I believe that sometimes, when you're fighting for the right reasons, things work out. But I also believe we make our own fate through the choices we make and the actions we take." Chapter 5. The convoy reached the checkpoint without further incident, but the mood was somber despite their victory. As they unloaded supplies and transferred prisoners to the garrison commander's custody, Traoré found himself thinking about the battle and what it represented. The checkpoint was a sad affair. a collection of sandbag bunkers and corrugated metal buildings surrounded by razor wire. The soldiers stationed there had the hollow-eyed look of men under constant stress, never knowing when the next attack would come. They greeted the supply convoy with obvious relief, but that relief was tempered by the knowledge that the supplies would only last so long, and then they would be back to rationing ammunition and hoping reinforcements arrived before the jihadists did. This was what had driven Traoré to action. This was why the coup had been necessary. These men deserved better than a government that abandoned them to die in forgotten outposts, while politicians in the capital argued over contracts and kickbacks. The garrison commander, a weathered major named Ouattara, shook Traoré's hand firmly. "You've given us a gift today, Captain. That cell has been a thorn in our side for weeks. They hit a civilian truck 2 days ago, killed everyone, took everything. We heard the firefight but couldn't leave to investigate." "How many men do you have here?" Traoré asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. 32. As of this morning. We're supposed to have 60, but replacements never arrive. Equipment is falling apart. Our radio barely works. Last month we went 3 weeks without a resupply because someone in Ouagadougou forgot to authorize the convoy. Ouattara's voice was bitter, but resigned. "We do what we can with what we have. Things are going to change," Traoré said quietly. "I promise you that. The old system is broken. We're building something new, something that actually supports the soldiers doing the fighting." Ouattara studied him carefully. "You were part of the coup, weren't you? People are talking. They say you and the others removed Damiba because he wasn't doing enough to win the war." "That's exactly why we did it," Traoré confirmed. "Damiba was better than what came before, but he was still part of the same system that got us into this mess. The corruption, the incompetence, the disconnect between the leadership and the men on the ground, it all had to change. And you think you can do better?" Traoré met the major's eyes steadily. "I think we have to try, because if we don't, if we just accept the way things are, then men like you and your soldiers will keep dying for nothing. The jihadists will keep gaining ground. The country will keep falling apart. I'm not claiming to have all the answers, but I know the old answers weren't working." Ouattara was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "There's a lot of hope riding on you and the new government, Captain. A lot of people believe you're different, that you actually care about more than just power. Don't prove them wrong." "I don't intend to," Traoré replied. Then, sensing the conversation was becoming too heavy, he shifted topics. "Tell me about the security situation in this sector. What's the enemy's pattern of movement?" They spent the next hour reviewing intelligence reports and updating maps. The picture that emerged was troubling but not unexpected. Jainim controlled large swaths of the northern territory, moving between villages and remote areas with relative impunity. They taxed local populations, recruited young men through a combination of ideology and coercion, and staged regular attacks on military positions and civilian targets. The government forces, stretched thin and poorly supplied, could do little more than defend key positions and hope to survive each day. Offensive operations were rare, and when they did occur, they often lacked the resources or intelligence to be truly effective. It was a defensive war of attrition, and attrition favored the enemy. "What we need," Ouattara said, tracing his finger along the map, "is better intelligence. We know JNIM is out there, we know they're planning attacks, but we don't know where they are or when they'll strike until it's too late. If we could get ahead of them, anticipate their movements, we could turn this from a defensive war into an offensive one," Traoré finished. "Take the initiative away from them, force them to react to us, instead of us always reacting to them." "Exactly. But that requires resources we don't have. Surveillance drones, signal intelligence capability, human intelligence networks in the villages. The kind of things the French used to provide before we asked them to leave," Traoré said. He didn't regret that decision. The French presence had become part of the problem, a reminder of colonial humiliation that fed into jihadist recruitment narratives. But he wouldn't deny that their departure had created gaps in capability. "We're working on solutions," he assured Ouattara. "New partnerships, new equipment, new training programs. It takes time, but it's coming." Ouattara looked skeptical but didn't argue. Time would tell whether Traoré's promises were genuine or just more empty words from politicians who didn't understand the reality on the ground. As the day wore on, Traoré interviewed the prisoners they had captured from the ambush. Most refused to talk. citing religious duty or simply remaining silent in sullen defiance. But one of them, a younger fighter who had been wounded in the leg, proved more communicative after receiving medical treatment. His name was Isaka, and he came from a village 50 kilometers to the north. He had joined JNIM 2 years earlier, after government soldiers had arrested his father on suspicion of supporting the jihadists. His father had been innocent, but he had died in custody anyway, and Isaka had blamed the government for his death. "I wanted revenge," Isaka admitted, his voice hollow. "They killed my father, so I would kill soldiers. It seemed simple. But then what?" Traoré prompted gently. "But then I saw what we were doing. The people we hurt weren't just soldiers. We raided villages, took food from families who were starving. We killed teachers, destroyed schools. I tried to tell the commanders this wasn't what I signed up for, but they said it was all necessary, all part of the struggle." Isaka looked up at Traoré, his eyes full of confusion and regret. "Was my father's death necessary? Were all those children who can't go to school now because we burned the buildings? Was that necessary?" Traoré didn't have an easy answer for that. "War makes people do terrible things," he said finally. "Both sides. I've seen government soldiers commit atrocities too. But that doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to be better." Chapter 6. After finishing the interviews, Traoré and his convoy prepared to return to their base. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. In the harsh landscape of the Sahel, sunsets were one of the few consistently beautiful things, a reminder that even in the midst of war and suffering, there was still beauty in the world. As they loaded up, one of Ouattara's soldiers approached Traoré. It was a young private, couldn't have been more than 19, with nervous energy and earnest eyes. "Captain, sir, I wanted to thank you for bringing the supplies, and for taking out that ambush cell." "Just doing our job, soldier," Traoré replied. "No, sir, it's more than that." The private struggled to find the right words. "Before, when the old government was in charge, nobody cared about us out here. We were forgotten. But now, with you and the new government, it feels like maybe someone is paying attention, like maybe we matter." Traoré put his hand on the young man's shoulder. "But you matter. Every soldier fighting to protect this country matters. Don't ever think otherwise." The private saluted sharply, and Traoré returned it, then climbed into his vehicle. As they drove away from the checkpoint, heading back toward their base in the fading light, he thought about that young soldier's words. The responsibility weighed heavily on him. These men had placed their faith in the coup, in the promise of change. If he and his fellow officers failed to deliver, that faith would turn to bitterness, and the country would slip further into chaos. The journey back was tense. Traveling at night was dangerous. The jihadists often used darkness to stage ambushes or plant IEDs, but staying at the checkpoint overnight would have left them exposed to attack. They drove with lights off, using night vision equipment to navigate, moving as quickly as the rough roads allowed. Twice they stopped when the point vehicle detected something suspicious, once for what turned out to be an abandoned farming implement, once for animal tracks that might have indicated a recent crossing by a large group. Both times proved to be false alarms, but they couldn't afford to be careless. They reached their base 3 hours after sunset, exhausted but intact. As the men unloaded equipment and debriefed, Traoré filed his after-action report. On paper, the engagement was a clear success. Enemy casualties high, friendly casualties minimal. Enemy attack plan disrupted. Prisoners taken for intelligence purposes. The numbers looked good. But Traoré couldn't shake the image of the young jihadist, Hamidou, dying in the ravine with his last words unfinished, or the haunted look in Isaka's eyes as he talked about his father and the revenge that had led him down a path he now regretted. These weren't just numbers. They were people, caught up in a conflict that had roots going back decades, fueled by poverty, injustice, religious extremism, and foreign interference. "You should get some rest, Captain," Sawadogo said, finding him in the operations room long after everyone else had gone to sleep. "You've been up for nearly 20 hours. "I will," Traoré promised. "Just want to finish this paperwork first. It can wait until morning." "I know, but He trailed off, not sure how to articulate what he was feeling. Sawadogo pulled up a chair and sat down. "What happened today got to you? That obvious. Only to someone who knows you. The men only see the decisive captain who won a firefight with no losses, but I see someone troubled by the necessity of it all. Traoré set down his pen and rubbed his tired eyes. There was a mother donkey on that road. She was blocking our path because her foal was trapped in the ravine where the jihadists were hiding. If she hadn't done that, we would have driven right into their ambush. Most of us would be dead right now. So you feel like you owe your life to a donkey? I feel like... Traoré searched for the right words. I feel like even the animals in this country are suffering from this war. That mother was desperate enough to approach humans, to risk herself, because she couldn't save her baby alone. What does it say about the state of things when even the wildlife is traumatized? Ouagadougou was quiet for a moment. It says we're in a bad situation, but it also says there's still compassion in the world. You could have ignored that donkey, pushed past it, focused only on the military mission. But you didn't. You investigated, and because you did, you not only saved your men but also saved that foal. Maybe that's what leadership is, caring about things even when it's not tactically necessary. Maybe, Traoré conceded. I just hope we can end this war before there's nothing left worth saving. We will. It'll take time, but we will. Traoré wished he could share his lieutenant's confidence, but doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when so many people were counting on him. So he pushed it down, locked it away with all the other complicated emotions that warfare generated, and focused on what needed to be done next. If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue bringing you more and more content. Chapter 7. The next morning brought new challenges. Intelligence reports indicated that JNIM was planning a major offensive in the region, possibly in retaliation for the ambush cell that Traoré's team had eliminated. The jihadists couldn't allow such a defeat to go unanswered without losing face and momentum. Traoré was summoned to a video conference with senior military leadership in Ouagadougou. The connection was poor, the video freezing intermittently and the audio cutting in and out, but he managed to brief them on the previous day's engagement and the current threat assessment. Colonel Traoré, no relation to the sergeant, listened intently from his air-conditioned office in the capital. He was one of the few senior officers who had supported the coup, recognizing that the previous system was beyond reform. But even he looked concerned as Traoré laid out the situation. You're saying JNIM might launch coordinated attacks on multiple positions simultaneously? The colonel asked, his image pixelating on the screen. That's what the prisoner intelligence suggests, sir, Traoré confirmed. They want to demonstrate that they're still a threat, that one setback doesn't diminish their capabilities. I'd estimate we have 3 days, maybe 4, before they move. Then we need to preempt them. Hit them first, disrupt their planning. With respect, sir, we don't have enough force in this sector for a major offensive operation. If we pull troops from defensive positions to stage attacks, we leave ourselves vulnerable. We need reinforcements. The colonel's expression tightened. Reinforcements are tied up in other sectors. You know the situation. We're fighting on multiple fronts with limited resources. You'll have to make do with what you have. It was the same answer Traoré had heard too many times before. Make do, improvise, do more with less. The reality of fighting an insurgency with an undermanned, under-equipped military, he felt the old frustration rising but tamped it down. Understood, sir. Then I request permission to conduct targeted raids on suspected JNIM positions. Small unit operations, in and out quickly. We can't match them in a sustained engagement, but we can keep them off balance. Force them to focus on defending themselves rather than planning attacks. Approved, but Captain... The colonel leaned closer to the camera. Be careful. You're becoming high profile, whether you want to be or not. If something happens to you, it'll be a propaganda victory for the enemy and a morale hit for our side. Take calculated risks, not stupid ones. I always do, sir. After the conference ended, Traoré assembled his officers to plan the raids. They spread maps across the table in the operations room, marking suspected enemy positions based on intelligence gathered from various sources, prisoner interrogations, civilian reports, signal intercepts, and pattern analysis of previous attacks. Here, here, and here, Ouagadougou said, pointing to 3 locations on the map. These villages have been reported as JNIM staging areas. They use them as safe houses, weapons caches, recruitment centers. Civilians? Traoré asked. Yes, sir. Mixed population. Some support the jihadists willingly, others are coerced or just trying to survive. We'll need to be careful to avoid collateral damage. That was always the challenge in this kind of warfare. The enemy didn't wear uniforms or maintain clear bases. They hid among the population, using civilians as shields and making every engagement a moral minefield. Too aggressive and you create more enemies than you eliminate. Killing innocents and feeding the jihadist narrative of government oppression. Too cautious and you give the enemy free rein to operate. We'll hit the weapons cache first, Traoré decided. It's outside the village proper, less risk of civilian casualties. If we can destroy their ammunition and explosives, it'll hamper their ability to launch the offensive they're planning. The team spent the rest of the day preparing. Weapons were cleaned and checked, ammunition distributed, vehicles serviced and fueled. Traoré insisted on inspecting everything personally, knowing that in combat, the smallest oversight could be fatal. A jammed weapon, a vehicle that wouldn't start, a radio that failed at the crucial moment. Any of these could turn success into disaster. As evening approached, he took a walk around the base perimeter. It wasn't much. A few buildings protected by sandbags and razor wire, some makeshift guard towers, an improvised motor pool. But it was home for now, and it represented something larger. The commitment to fight for Burkina Faso's future, to push back against the forces that wanted to drag the country into chaos. He found Sergeant Caboret checking the perimeter defenses, as was his habit every evening. The older man had been in the military longer than Traoré had been alive, and his experience showed in everything he did. "So getting nervous before the raid?" Caboret asked without preamble. "Always am," Traoré admitted. "The day I stop being nervous is the day I get careless." "Good answer. I've seen too many young officers get overconfident, think they're invincible, usually right before they get themselves and their men killed." Caboret paused in his inspection to look at Traoré directly. "You're different, though. You've got that spark, that thing that makes men want to follow you. Just make sure you don't burn yourself out trying to save everyone. Someone has to try." "True. But remember, you can't save a country if you're dead. Strategic thinking, Captain. Pick your battles, know when to advance and when to fall back. That's how you win wars." "Is that how we're going to win this one?" Caboret smiled grimly. "This one? This war isn't about winning in the traditional sense. It's about lasting long enough that the enemy gives up, that the population stops supporting them, that we build something stable enough to withstand the pressure. It's a long game, and you need to pace yourself. I'll try to remember that. Do, because right now, you're one of the few leaders people actually believe in. Don't waste that." That night, Traoré lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the base, generators humming, guards changing shifts, the distant howl of jackals in the darkness beyond the wire. He thought about the mother donkey and her foal, about Hamidou dying with his last words unfinished, about the young soldier at the checkpoint who believed things might finally get better. The weight of expectation was enormous. He was just one man, a military officer who had gotten involved in a coup because the previous government was failing the soldiers on the front lines. He hadn't asked to be a symbol or a leader beyond his rank, but that's what had happened, and now he had to live up to it or watch everything fall apart. Eventually, exhaustion overtook anxiety, and he fell into a restless sleep filled with dreams of dusty roads and frightened animals and young men dying in ravines under an indifferent sun. Chapter 8. They moved out before dawn, 4 vehicles carrying 20 soldiers. The air was cold, that brief window before sunrise when the desert actually felt pleasant rather than oppressive. Visibility was limited, but they couldn't risk traveling in daylight. The drone observation had reported regular enemy patrols in the area they were targeting. The cache location was in a rocky outcrop 20 kilometers north of their base, hidden in what appeared to be a natural cave system. Intelligence suggested the jihadists had been stockpiling weapons and explosives there for weeks, preparing for their planned offensive. Taking it out would be a significant blow. They traveled without lights, using night vision equipment to navigate the rough terrain. It was slow, nerve-wracking work. Every shadow could be an ambush. Every depression in the ground could hide an IED. But the soldiers were professionals, and they moved with the confidence that came from experience. Traoré rode in the second vehicle, monitoring radio traffic and reviewing the operation plan one more time in his mind. They would approach from the east, using a dried riverbed for cover. A 6-man assault team would secure the cave entrance, while the rest provided overwatch and blocked potential escape routes. Plant explosives, fall back, detonate, simple in theory, complicated in execution. As they neared the target area, he ordered the convoy to halt. They would cover the last kilometer on foot, leaving a small guard for the vehicles. The men dismounted silently, checking weapons and equipment one final time. Traoré could see the tension in their faces, the focus that came before combat. These were good soldiers, dedicated and brave. He would do everything in his power to bring them all home safely. The approach through the riverbed was treacherous. The bottom was strewn with rocks and debris, and the banks rose 3 meters on either side, limiting visibility. It would be a perfect place for an ambush. But intelligence had indicated the enemy focused their security around the cache itself, not the approaches. Traoré hoped that intelligence was accurate. They reached the observation point without incident. Using binoculars, Traoré studied the cave entrance. It was partially hidden behind a boulder, just as the reports had indicated. There was no obvious guard presence, but that didn't mean much. Sentries could be inside or watching from concealed positions. "Corporal Zundi, take your team and establish the fire base on that ridge," Traoré whispered, pointing to an elevated position with a clear view of the cave. "Sergeant Cabaret, your team will provide close support for the assault. Lieutenant Sawadogo, you're with me on the assault." The men moved into position with practiced efficiency. Within 10 minutes, they were ready. Traoré checked his watch. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east. They needed to move before full daylight exposed them. "All teams, radio check," he whispered into his headset. One by one, the teams confirmed readiness. Traoré took a deep breath, sent a silent prayer to whichever higher power might be listening, and gave the order, "Execute." The assault team moved quickly toward the cave entrance, weapons raised, spacing intervals maintained. Traoré was third in the line, his heart pounding but his hands steady. This was what he had trained for, what years of combat had prepared him to do. They reached the boulder without challenge. Sawadogo peeked around it, then signaled, "One guard," visible inside the cave mouth, looking inward, not outward. Careless, but it would be their last mistake. The lieutenant moved with lethal efficiency. A single suppressed shot, and the guard crumpled without a sound. The team rushed forward into the cave, clearing angles, checking for additional threats. The cave opened into a larger chamber, and what Traoré saw there made his blood run cold. The intelligence had been accurate about the weapons cache: crates of ammunition, stacks of RPGs, boxes of explosives. But it had failed to mention the other occupants of the cave. Tied up against the far wall were 6 civilians, 4 adults and 2 children. They were gagged, their eyes wide with terror, as armed men burst into the cave. Next to them stood 3 jihadist fighters, who had been in the process of placing explosives among the hostages. Time seemed to slow. Traoré's mind raced through the implications. The jihadists were booby-trapping the hostages, planning to use them as human shields or detonators. If they had simply blown the cache as planned, these 6 innocent people would have died in the explosion. One of the jihadists reached for his weapon. Traoré fired first. 2 shots sent a mass. The man went down. Sawadogo took out the second fighter before he could raise his AK-47. The third turned and ran deeper into the cave system, disappearing into darkness. "Clear left, clear right," the team called out, sweeping the chamber. "Sawadogo, get those hostages out of here," Traoré ordered. "Cabaret, get a team in here to secure this cache. Nobody touch anything until our EOD specialist checks for booby traps." As his men worked to free the terrified hostages, Traoré examined the explosives the jihadists had been placing. It was sophisticated work, pressure triggers, anti-tamper devices, enough explosive power to bring down the entire cave system. If they had detonated their charges remotely as planned, not only would the hostages have died, but the cave entrance would have been sealed, trapping the weapons inside, but also making a statement. See what the government does. They kill civilians in their operations. It was a propaganda trap as much as a military one. Chapter 9. The freed hostages were in shock, trembling and crying as Sawadogo's team cut them loose and guided them out of the cave. Traoré followed, leaving specialists to carefully disarm the explosives and catalogue the weapons cache. Outside, in the growing light of dawn, he could finally see their faces clearly. The adults were a family, a father, mother, and 2 teenagers. The children were younger, maybe 6 and 8 years old. They clung to their parents, too traumatized to even cry properly. The mother kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "Thank you, thank you, thank God, thank you." "What's your name?" Traoré asked the father gently. "Musa," the man replied, his voice hoarse. "We're from the village of Kariba, 5 kilometers east. The jihadists came 3 days ago. They took us, said we would be martyrs for the cause. We tried to tell them we didn't want any part of their war, but they didn't care. You're safe now," Traoré assured him. "We'll get you back to your village." "The village?" Musa's expression darkened. "There is no village anymore. They burned it, killed anyone who resisted. These are the only ones left from our family. My brother, his wife, their 3 children, all dead." The stark brutality of it hit Traoré hard. This was the reality of the insurgency. Entire families wiped out, villages destroyed, lives shattered. And for what? Some abstract ideology about pure Islam and jihad against the government, the cruel calculus of terror as a political tool. One of the children, the 8-year-old boy, tugged at Traoré's sleeve. "Are you going to kill the bad men?" he asked, his voice small but earnest. Traoré knelt down to the boy's level. "We're going to stop them from hurting anyone else," he said carefully. "That's our job, to protect people like you and your family." "But they said you were the bad men," the boy continued, confused. "They said the government kills Muslims, that soldiers are enemies of God. Sometimes people lie to justify the terrible things they do," Traoré replied. "We're not perfect, no army is, but we're not trying to hurt innocent people. We're trying to stop those who are—" The boy seemed to consider this, then nodded slowly. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant. One child, choosing to believe in something better despite what he had been told, despite what he had experienced. Sergeant Kabore emerged from the cave. "Captain, you need to see this. The cache is bigger than we thought, and there's something else." Traoré left the civilians with Sawadogo and followed Kabore back into the cave. The explosives had been disarmed, and the chamber was being systematically searched. What they had found was staggering. Not just weapons, but documents, maps, laptops, communication equipment. This wasn't just a weapons cache, it was a command center. "Look at this," Kabore said, showing Traoré a laptop that their technical specialist had managed to access. The screen showed detailed plans for coordinated attacks across 3 provinces. They were planning something big. Multiple simultaneous strikes on civilian targets, markets, schools, medical clinics. The goal was maximum casualties and terror. Traoré studied the plans with growing anger. The attacks would have killed hundreds, maybe thousands, women, children, elderly. The jihadists didn't discriminate in their violence, and they would have blamed the government somehow, claimed they were forced into it, that it was a response to oppression. "Copy everything," he ordered. "I want every byte of data from these devices, maps, photographs, everything. This is an intelligence goldmine." As the team worked, Traoré explored deeper into the cave system. The fleeing jihadist had disappeared into these tunnels, and while pursuit was dangerous, Traoré wanted to understand the layout. He moved carefully, his rifle light cutting through the darkness, revealing natural rock formations and evidence of recent human activity. He found the body about 50 meters in. The jihadist who had fled had run headlong into a dead end, panicked, and apparently tried to climb the sheer rock wall. He had fallen, striking his head on a boulder. Blood pooled beneath him, dark in the light of Traoré's flashlight. Traoré checked for a pulse. Found none. Another death. Another young man who would never go home to his family. He searched the body, finding a phone with several contacts and recent messages, more intelligence to harvest. But he also found something else. A photo, creased and worn from being carried in a pocket. It showed the dead jihadist as a much younger man, maybe a teenager, standing with an older couple who were probably his parents. They were smiling, ordinary people in ordinary clothing, a snapshot of a life before war and extremism. Traoré pocketed the photo along with the phone. Someday, maybe that family could have closure. They could know what happened to their son, could bury him according to their customs, could grieve properly. It was a small mercy, but in this war, small mercies were all anyone could offer. When he emerged from the cave, the sun was fully up. His men had loaded the captured weapons and equipment into the vehicles, secured the documents and electronic devices, and prepared the cave for demolition. The hostages were safely in one of the trucks, covered with blankets and drinking water. "Ready when you are, Captain," Cabaret reported. Traoré took one last look at the cave entrance. Inside was the detonator for charges they had placed throughout the chamber. In a few minutes, this place would cease to exist, buried under tons of rock. One less base for the enemy, one less cache of weapons they could use to kill innocents. But he felt no satisfaction in the victory, just tired acceptance that this was necessary, that destruction was sometimes the only path forward when rebuilding seemed impossible. "Blow it," he ordered. The explosion was massive, the concussion wave washing over them even at their safe distance. The cave entrance collapsed in on itself, rock and dust billowing outward in a cloud that blotted out the sun for a moment. When it cleared, there was nothing left but a pile of rubble. Chapter 10. The drive back to base was subdued. The rescued hostages were quiet, processing their trauma. The soldiers were exhausted, the adrenaline of combat giving way to the crash that always followed. Traoré spent the time reviewing the captured documents, his mind working through the implications. The plans they had found revealed a network much larger than he had imagined. JNIM wasn't just a loose collection of local cells, it was a coordinated organization with strategic planning, resource allocation, and clear objectives. They had contacts in multiple countries, funding sources from external supporters, and a sophisticated understanding of information warfare. This wasn't just an insurgency that could be defeated by military force alone. It was a movement fed by grievances, both real and manufactured, exploiting poverty and marginalization, offering purpose and identity to young men who felt forgotten by society. Fighting it would require more than guns and explosives. When they reached the base, Traoré immediately arranged for medical care for the hostages and debriefing of his team. Then he locked himself in his office with the captured intelligence, determined to understand what they were really facing. Hours passed as he read through documents, studied maps, listened to recorded conversations. A picture emerged of an enemy that was both brutal and rational, willing to commit atrocities, but also capable of strategic thinking. They targeted not just military positions, but also the social fabric of communities, killing teachers, destroying schools, assassinating traditional leaders who opposed them. They were trying to create a vacuum that only they could fill, positioning themselves as the only source of order and authority. One document particularly caught his attention. It was a training manual for new recruits, outlining the ideology and tactics they were expected to adopt. Much of it was standard jihadist rhetoric, grievances against Western influence, calls for Islamic governance, promises of paradise for martyrs. But there were also sections on psychological warfare, on how to exploit tribal divisions, on techniques for intimidating populations. What struck Traoré most was the section on government forces. The manual portrayed soldiers not as individuals, but as symbols, servants of the corrupt regime, enemies of the faith, tools of Western imperialism. It dehumanized them thoroughly, making it easier for young recruits to kill without hesitation or guilt. He thought about Hamidou, the young fighter who had died in the ravine. Had he read this manual? Had these words been the ones that hardened his heart, that made him willing to kill and die for a cause that ultimately meant nothing? How many other young men had been twisted by this propaganda, turned into weapons against their own people? A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. It was Sawadogo carrying a meal. "You haven't eaten all day, Captain. The men are worried about you." "I'm fine," Traoré protested, but his stomach betrayed him with a loud rumble. "Eat," Sawadogo ordered, setting the plate down firmly. "Whatever you're reading can wait 15 minutes. As Traoré ate mechanically, Sawadogo sat across from him. "What did you find in those documents?" "Nothing good," Traoré replied between bites. "They're more organized than we thought, better funded, more sophisticated. This isn't just a local problem anymore. It's regional, maybe international. Can we beat them?" It was a simple question with no simple answer. Militarily, maybe, if we had unlimited resources and time. But that's not how we win this war. We have to address the underlying issues: poverty, corruption, lack of services in rural areas. We have to give people alternatives to extremism, reasons to support the government instead of the jihadists. "That's a tall order for a military officer," Sawadogo observed. "I know, but that's what it's going to take. Otherwise, we're just playing whack-a-mole. taking out one cell while two more pop up elsewhere. They sat in silence for a moment, both understanding the magnitude of the challenge. Then Sawadogo spoke again. "The hostages you rescued today, Musa and his family, they want to thank you properly, to express their gratitude. I told them you were busy, but—" "No, I should see them," Traoré decided. He needed the reminder of why they were fighting, of what was at stake beyond military objectives and political considerations. He found the family in the medical tent, where they had been examined and cleared of serious injuries. The children had fallen asleep, exhausted, but the adults were awake. Musa stood when Traoré entered, his wife beside him. "Captain, Musa struggled to find words adequate to express what he felt. "You saved our lives, our children's lives. We can never repay you." "No payment necessary," Traoré assured him. "It's what we're supposed to do, protect citizens. Most soldiers I've encountered were not like you," Musa said carefully. "Some were good, but many, they took what they wanted, threatened us, treated us like we were the enemy just because we live in the north." Traoré felt shame at that, knowing it was probably true. The military had discipline problems. Soldiers who saw every civilian in rebel-held areas as a potential threat or target. It was one of the things he was determined to change. "That shouldn't have happened," he said, "and I'm working to make sure it doesn't happen in the future. But I need your help." Chapter 11. Musa looked surprised. "My help? What can I do?" "Tell me about your village," Traoré requested. "Tell me what happened there, how the jihadists operated, who supported them and why." Over the next hour, Musa painted a picture that was both illuminating and disturbing. His village had been like many in the north, poor, neglected by the government, struggling to survive in harsh conditions. The jihadists had arrived not as conquerors, but as providers, offering money for recruits, paying for community projects, positioning themselves as an alternative authority. At first, many people were grateful, Musa explained. The government had forgotten us. Police came once a year to collect taxes, but never to provide protection. Schools had no teachers, clinics had no medicine. Then Jainim arrived and suddenly there was money, organization, attention. But that changed. Yes, once they had established themselves, they became demanding. They wanted more recruits, more supplies. They imposed their version of Islamic law, which was much stricter than what we practiced. Women were restricted, music was banned. Anyone who disagreed was beaten or killed. The village elders who had initially welcomed them tried to push back, but Musa's voice broke. They were executed as examples. After that, everyone was too afraid to resist. "What about the young men who joined them?" Traoré asked. "Were they true believers, or did they have other motivations?" "Both," Musa replied. Some genuinely believed in the ideology that they were fighting for Islam and justice, but others just wanted money, status, adventure. Many were unemployed with no prospects. Jainim offered them something to do, something to be. It's easy to radicalize someone who feels hopeless and forgotten. It was a pattern Traoré had seen repeated across the Sahel. Jihadist groups didn't just recruit through ideology. They exploited economic desperation, social marginalization, and the failure of governments to provide basic services. Every young man who joined them was both a perpetrator and a victim, someone who made terrible choices but often from a limited set of options. "If you could change one thing," Traoré asked Musa, "one thing that would have prevented JNIM from gaining a foothold in your village, what would it be?" Musa thought carefully before answering. "Opportunity. If there had been jobs, if the government had shown they cared about us, if there had been some hope for a better future, I think many young men would have chosen differently." It's hard to recruit jihadists in places where people are happy and prosperous. It was a simple answer, but profound. Development, not just security. Investment, not just military operations. A government that actually served its people, not just extracted from them. "I'm going to try," Traoré promised. "I can't fix everything, but I'm going to try to address these issues." The coup we staged wasn't just about removing corrupt leaders. It was about fundamentally changing how this country operates. "Many people are skeptical," Musa said gently. "They've heard promises before, but I believe you mean what you say. The question is whether one man or even a group of men can overcome decades of failure and corruption." "I don't know," Traoré admitted, "but I have to try. Because if we don't change things, this war will never end." We'll just keep fighting, keep dying, and in 20 years we'll still be having this same conversation. After the meeting, Traoré arranged for transport to take Musa and his family to a safe area where they had relatives. It wasn't much. They had lost their home, most of their possessions, and many of their family members. But at least they were alive, and alive meant hope for rebuilding. As he watched the vehicle drive away, carrying the family toward an uncertain future, Traoré thought about the weight of responsibility. How many other families were out there, caught between government forces and jihadists, just trying to survive? How many had already been destroyed by this senseless conflict? The next few days were consumed by processing the intelligence they had captured and planning follow-up operations. The laptop data revealed several other JNIM positions and safe houses, and Traoré coordinated with other units to conduct simultaneous raids. It was a successful week, militarily speaking. Multiple cells neutralized, weapons confiscated, plots disrupted. But Traoré couldn't shake the feeling that they were winning battles but not the war. For every jihadist they killed or captured, how many new recruits were being radicalized by poverty, injustice, or government failures? For every cache they destroyed, how many more were being stockpiled elsewhere? One evening he received a radio call from Major Ouattara at the checkpoint they had resupplied. "Captain Traoré, I wanted to inform you. We had a situation today that I thought you'd want to know about." "What kind of situation?" "3 young men from a nearby village came to the checkpoint. They said they wanted to surrender, that they had been with JNIM but didn't want to fight anymore. They heard about what you did, rescuing those hostages from the cave, and they decided that maybe the government wasn't as bad as they'd been told." Traoré felt a surge of hope. 3 men wasn't much, but it represented something important. A crack in the jihadist narrative, a sign that hearts and minds could be changed. "What did you do with them?" he asked. "Took them into custody, as per procedure. They're being processed now." "But Captain, they're just kids, 17, 18 years old. They joined because there was nothing else for them, and now they want out. What happens to them?" It was a good question. The official policy was to prosecute anyone who had taken up arms against the government, but prosecuting desperate teenagers who had been manipulated by skilled recruiters didn't seem like justice. It seemed like perpetuating the cycle. "See if you can get them into a de-radicalization program," Traoré suggested. "There's a pilot project running in Ouagadougou. If they're genuinely willing to reintegrate into society, to speak out against extremism, then maybe they can be part of the solution instead of the problem." "You think that'll work?" "I think we have to try everything, because purely military solutions aren't working. We need to give people alternatives, ways out of extremism that don't involve death or imprisonment." Chapter 12. Weeks passed, and the situation in the northern region stabilized somewhat. The intelligence from the cave raid led to several successful operations, and JNIM's planned offensive never materialized, but Traoré knew it was temporary. The jihadists would regroup, adapt, and continue their campaign. What gave him hope was the small changes he was seeing. More civilians were coming forward with information, no longer as afraid of government retaliation or jihadist reprisal. The checkpoint Ouattara commanded reported fewer attacks and more cooperation from local communities. The 3 young men who had surrendered were proving to be valuable sources of intelligence while also spreading the word that leaving JNIM was possible. It wasn't peace, not even close, but it was progress. And in this war, progress was measured in inches, not miles. One morning, as Traoré was preparing for another patrol, he received an unexpected visitor. A village elder from a community 30 kilometers away had traveled to the base specifically to speak with him. His name was Ibrahim, the same as Traoré's, and he had a weathered face that spoke of decades of hardship. "Captain, I heard about what you did," the old man said. "How you saved those hostages, how you're trying to protect civilians, not just fight battles. I wanted to meet you, to see if the stories were true." "What stories?" Traoré asked, curious. "That there's a soldier who cares about more than just killing, who understands that this war is about people, not just territory or ideology. A soldier who might actually make things better." Traoré felt uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm just doing my job, elder, trying to do it the right way." "No," the old man insisted. "You're doing more than that. You're giving people hope. In my village, young men talk about you. They say if all soldiers were like Captain Traoré, they would support the government. That's powerful. It's also a heavy responsibility. Yes. But that's what leadership is, carrying weight that others cannot. My grandfather used to say that a leader is someone who sees what needs to be done and does it, even when it's hard, even when others would turn away. They talked for over an hour, the old man sharing wisdom accumulated over a lifetime of surviving in this harsh land. He spoke of cycles of violence and peace, of how communities healed after trauma, of the importance of reconciliation even with enemies. The jihadists today were children yesterday, he said. And today's children will be tomorrow's either soldiers or jihadists, depending on what kind of world we build for them. If we only build a world of violence, that's what they'll become. But if we can build something better, then maybe the cycle breaks, Traoré finished. Maybe, inshallah. After the elder left, Traoré stood at the base perimeter, looking out at the vast Sahel landscape. It was harsh, unforgiving, beautiful in its starkness. This was his country, the land he had sworn to protect. Not just the territory, but the people who called it home, the communities that had endured centuries of hardship and conflict. He thought about the mother donkey that had blocked the road, desperate to save her foal. In a way, wasn't that what he was trying to do? Save a country's future, protect the next generation from the violence that had consumed this one. It seemed impossible some days, the challenges too vast, the enemies too numerous, the problems too deeply rooted. But then he remembered Musa's family, alive because his team had investigated instead of ignoring a frightened animal. He thought about the 3 young men who had surrendered, choosing a different path. He recalled the soldiers at the checkpoint, who now had supplies and hope because someone had cared enough to fight through danger to reach them. Small victories, yes, but small victories accumulated. Change happened incrementally, through individual choices and actions. He couldn't save everyone, couldn't fix everything, but he could keep trying, keep fighting for something better than what had come before. A young soldier approached him, saluting crisply. "Captain, the patrol is ready to move out." Traoré returned the salute, then took one last look at the horizon. The sun was rising, painting the sky in brilliant colors, promising another day of heat and challenge and opportunity. "Let's go," he said. As they drove out of the base, heading into contested territory once again, Traoré thought about all that had happened since that day when a frightened donkey had changed everything. He had discovered rebels in a ravine, yes, but he had also discovered something more important, that even in the midst of war there was room for compassion, for mercy, for trying to do things the right way. The war wasn't over. It wouldn't be for years, maybe decades. But every day he woke up and chose to fight not just with weapons, but with principle, with integrity, with a vision of something better. That was a victory in itself. The convoy rolled on through the dusty landscape, heading toward whatever challenges the day would bring. And Traoré, captain of Burkina Faso's armed forces, leader of the coup that had promised change, felt ready to face them. Because that's what leadership meant, carrying on even when the weight was heavy, finding hope even in desperation, building something better even as the old world crumbled around you. One frightened donkey had shown him that even small acts of courage could change the course of events. Now it was his turn to be that catalyst for change, to be the person who stood in the path of destruction and said, "No further, not today, not on my watch." The road ahead was long, the battles many, the outcome uncertain. But as long as he and men like him kept fighting for something worth believing in, there was hope. And hope, in the end, was what this war was really about. End.